This morning, we'll talk about cash, the money in your pockets, the money the government has got to spend, and when, as a country, we can be confident there'll be a bit more to go around. Interest rates up, council tax up. Inflation, you guessed it, that's going up too.
We've seen signs of inflation really peaking now, but of course it's far too high.
The opposite to what the Prime Minister claims to you.
We're halving inflation by paying 50% of people's energy bills and freezing fuel duty.
Not yet, he's not. There's price pressure on everyone, just as the extent of Sunak and Starmer's income is revealed. Mega wealth for one, doing rather well for the other one, as official figures for the first time reveal very different numbers. More than 2 million people using food banks just to get by.
A lot of the time it means either starving or getting something to eat.
So we have one big question this morning. When will everyone start to feel better off? This man does the sums that tell the government how much cash they have. But why do they sometimes get it wrong? We'll ask the boss of the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility, Richard Hughes. It's Michael Gove's job to make sure the chance of a good life is spread fairly across the land. But can he level up when living standards are going down? Labour's Lucy Powell has big plans for the BBC. But what's the problem that she's trying to fix? And remember this act of courage. Marina Ovsyannikova famously interrupted live TV in Russia to protest against the war in Ukraine. She'll tell us about her astonishing escape.
I was almost screaming, thinking and saying it's better for me to go back to Russia, go to prison. But my daughter was saying, get up, let's go, we have to cross the border.
More of her amazing story in about half an hour. And welcome to my amazing panel this morning. Andy Haldane, one of the best economic brains in the country, who spent many years as Bank of England top brass. Christiana Figueres, who was the United Nations top climate chief. And the John Lewis boss turned Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands is here, Andy Street. Morning, and I promise you we will be bring you things to be cheerful about, as well as some grim news. But let's see what is getting people going this morning. Let's go straight to the front pages. A bit of a mixed bag today. The front of the Sunday Times has a story that says children as young as 8 are being strip searched. The Observer has a story that's caused some red faces in the Tory parties. A sting where they've seen MPs being offered £10,000 a day to work for a fake company. But the tabloids, again, a mixed bag. The front page of the Mail on Sunday in Scotland, talking about the potential new First Minister, Kate Forbes, that announcement coming tomorrow. And the Sunday Express mentioning something we'll be talking about with Michael Gove in a few minutes, the government's promised blitz on antisocial behaviour. But let's first of all talk with our panel about the big picture of what's going on in the country. We saw inflation going up again this week by surprise, interest rates going up again. Andy, is it going to come down, as the Bank of England and the government really hopes, by the end of the year?
Yes. I think that's pretty nailed on, Laura. Morning, by the way. As the effects of last year's energy price rises fall out, and energy prices have fallen since, we'll see inflation falling pretty rapidly in the next month or so, I think. But
by how much? So the bank and the government says maybe back down all the way nearly to 1 to 3%.
That's not out of the question, I would say. And that will mean, into the second half of the year, Laura, I think we will see things feel a bit better for the average household after a horrible income squeeze over the last 18 months or so.
One of the things about this is how people, the difference between what's on spreadsheets and the difference to how people feel. I mean, Andy, you represent, millions of people in the West Midlands. Does the economy feel like it's working for the people that you represent there?
Yeah, good morning, Tim.
Good morning.
Yeah, the answer is it's a mixed picture, actually. If you're right at the bottom of the income levels, spending a lot of your money on heating and on food, it's really tough. We can see that. But what we also see in our economy, after a big adjustment after COVID, we were doing very well, some of our traditional sectors very hard, like manufacturing. We're seeing incredible growth in some of the new areas. Technology, the green economy, really good. And actually construction and the professional services also coming back strongly. So it's a mixed picture, is the truth.
You have been a bit cross, though, about how the government has tried to spread some of the country's wealth, such as it is. And you accuse the government's levelling up plan of being like asking people like you to go to Whitehall with a begging bowl.
And there's been a decisive response to that in the last couple of weeks, which I'm sure you might even talk to Michael about, actually, in the devolution deal that's been struck for us and for Greater Manchester, where we end the begging bowl, really. And what we move to is trusting regions with a big sum of money, a single pot, as it's been called, and we take the decisions locally. So it is a decisive change in direction.
But have you now got all the power that you want?
We never have all that we want, but we've certainly got, I would say, actually, the boot in the sense is on the other foot now. We've got to demonstrate what we're going to do with it to show that trust is well placed.
Okay, interesting. One of the things you mentioned there is food inflation. Now, Christiana, this is absolutely one of the things that you have looked at. Is food always going to be expensive as we carry on with things as they are?
That very much depends on how we're producing food. So let's look a little bit under the hood. Yesterday, I spent some time with mothers here in the UK who are hunger striking, demonstrating in front of Parliament because 1 in 4 mothers in the UK, one of the richest countries in the world, have to choose between feeding themselves and feeding their children. You know which choice they're making. 1 in 10 children globally do not have enough food. Why? For many reasons, but there are 2 global reasons behind this. First, the absolutely outrageous prices of fossil fuels due to the politicization of fossil fuels. And secondly, the decreasing crop yields that are also due to extreme weather events because of the burning of fossil fuels. So 2 different problems, same root cause, fossil fuels. Therefore, we have to understand that moving away from fossil fuels over to clean energy and technology actually is a measure to protect the most vulnerable.
Okay, well, later on we'll ask you also to give some solutions to that problem, but all 3 of you, thank you very much for your thoughts just now, because this morning we are trying to work out when most people can expect to feel a bit better off after years of hard times for many. In a second we'll talk to Michael Gove, but one of the difficult things about all of this is that the crystal ball is a bit wonky when it comes to predicting what might happen. Now, the Office for Budget Responsibility was set up in 2010. It's independent, and every 6 months it tells the government and all of us what is going to happen to the economy, how much it will grow, how much it will shrink, and how much money the government has to play with. Now, it's important because they check the government sums for all of us. But the reality is their forecasts, just like the weather ones, sometimes turn out to be wrong. Take a look at these. In March, they said the rate prices would increase would peak at 8.7%. Actually, look at it go up to 11.1. Now it's 10.4. They also predicted that the government would borrow £177 billion last year. But in the end, actually, it was 99 billion. Now that gave ministers, hypothetically, a lot more cash to play with. And the OBR told us before that right now we would be in recession, except we're not, although only just. So if the numbers slide all over the place like that, how can we know as a country when we will start to feel a bit better off? I asked the boss of the OBR, Richard Hughes, why they often get it a bit wrong.
So all forecasts in the end turn out to be wrong. Every forecast has an error. Even weather forecasters don't get the exact rainfall right on a given week or the exact temperature on a given day. And I think in particular in the UK, we are forecasting in an incredibly volatile environment like every country is at the moment, because energy prices have been rising 5-fold and then falling back by a half in the course of the last year or so. Interest rates have trebled over the course of the last year. So it's a very volatile environment in which to be forecasting.
Do you have too much influence over politicians making decisions?
I think politicians always base their decisions on a forecast from somebody. It used to be these forecasts were done inside the Treasury. In the UK, we made a decision to outsource those to the OBR. We did that 13 years ago. And I think our forecasting record turns out to be slightly better than the forecasting record of the Treasury when it was doing the forecasts back before 2010. We have lower forecast errors and also less biased forecasts than the Treasury used to produce.
But how confident are you inflation's actually going to fall to less than 3%?
I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty around the outlook for inflation, but it is the case that of the double-digit inflation that we're seeing at the moment, around half of that is coming from energy prices and food prices. And when you look ahead, there are a number of factors which ought to bring those prices down over the remainder of the year.
Do you think we'll ever see food prices coming down? Because the level of some things right now is astronomical compared to where they were even a few months ago.
Some of them may do, but you're right that our fundamental challenge as a country is that we are a net importer of food, we are a net importer of energy, and the prices of the things which we consume have been rising at twice the pace of the prices of the things which we produce. And that just means that as a country we are poorer, we are worse off, because our wages can't keep pace with the prices of the things like energy, like food, which are setting global markets and have been rising a lot faster than the prices of the things which we produce.
And how would you describe the overall state of the economy?
I think we're seeing clearly the biggest squeeze on living standards we faced in this country on record. But we do expect, as we get past this year and we go into the next 3 or 4 years, that real income starts to recover. But it's still the case that people's real spending power doesn't get back to the level it was before the pandemic, even after 5 years, even by the time we get to the late 2020s.
That's so grim, though. You're saying it might be another 5 or even 6 years until people start feeling better off again.
That's right, based on our latest forecast, and it's partly because UK growth has been held back by a range of supply constraints on some of the key drivers of growth. We've lost around 500,000 people from the labour force, we've seen stagnant investment since 2016, and also our productivity has slowed dramatically since the financial crisis and not really recovered.
How much stronger would the economy be if we'd stayed in the EU?
We think that in the long run, it reduces our overall output by around 4% compared to had we remained in the EU.
How would you describe 4%, though? Would that be the equivalent of another conflict or a smaller pandemic?
I struggle to put it in any kind of sensible context. I mean, it's a shock to the UK economy of the order of magnitude of the sorts of other shocks that we've seen from the pandemic, from the energy crisis. Those have also had percentage point impacts on the level of output in 5-10 years' time.
Now, I want to ask you about one huge long-term issue. You've forecast if nothing's done to halt climate change, our debt to GDP ratio might rise to 289% of GDP by the end of the century. Now, that seems hard to imagine. What would that feel like?
So that would be the level of debt that we had basically at the end of the Second World War. So on a sort of cataclysm of that stage and consequences for the economy and consequences for the government finances of that sort of magnitude. So a lot of our economic model would cease to work. A lot of our infrastructure would end up being underwater or unusable. We would have housing which would be close to floodplains, which would be underwater. So the damage to the economy comes from the fact that the infrastructure that you've got ceases to be usable because it is too close to the water level, or global temperatures mean that things like UK agriculture become non-viable.
Our thanks to Richard Hughes. So let's dive straight in with Michael Gove. Welcome to you. You've just heard there the official number crunchers say that it might be 5 or 6 years before people really start to feel better off again. Do you think that's right?
We don't know. And I think, to be fair to Richard Hughes, he was very clear that forecasting is a very, very difficult exercise. I'm not going to criticise forecasters. I mean, I wrote a book called Michael Portillo, The Future of the Right, so I'm not very good at forecasting the future. But I do know that, as Richard quite rightly pointed out, we're dealing with the aftershocks of two, significant events. So both the war in Ukraine, first time we've had war on this scale on the continent of Europe since the Second World War, and the COVID pandemic, the biggest global health pandemic since the end of the First World War. They have had a huge effect on our economy and on others' economies.
But every country has had that, and this country has also had, as you heard Richard say there, a shock to the economy from the disruption of Brexit, which you backed. And what the impact of that is for people right now, not forecasting into the future, is a very serious squeeze on living standards. Now, by any measure, notwithstanding the fact that you've had to cope with all sorts of different things, by any measure, the Conservatives have been in charge for 13 years. So is it a failure that our viewers this morning are living through the biggest drop in living standards on record?
No, and to be fair, both in your question and in what Richard Hughes said, the context was provided. And this government, Rishi Sunak, has ensured that we've taken action to help people with the cost of living. So the steps that were taken, both in the recent budget, but even before that, have helped people through this difficult time. So we have a windfall tax on oil and gas companies, so that some of the...
You fought against to begin with and then took the policy from the Labour Party.
Not quite, because the Labour approach would have been different from us. But anyway, he took the firm but fair step of making sure that we would ensure that companies which were benefiting actually as a result of the conflict paid their fair share to help people with their energy bills, and people's energy bills are broadly half what they would otherwise have been as a result of what Rishi and Jeremy have done. But those aren't the only steps that we've taken. We've also taken the, for me, difficult and unpalatable decision to increase taxation on other businesses in order to help people through these difficult times as well.
But Richard Hughes has said very plainly to us, we are poorer. We are a poorer country. So if we're having a really honest conversation about this with our audience this morning, do you accept that we are a poorer country than we were going to be?
Well, everyone, I think, accepts, yes, that if we hadn't had the war, the impact that it's had, as we've heard, on fossil fuel prices and on other supplies as well, including food, if we hadn't had the COVID pandemic, then we would have been in a position where our growth rate was significantly higher.
But is that also a reflection on the government? I mean, you say there that the government has spent billions trying to help people. That is true, but they have spent billions on an energy policy, for example, that has helped every single household in the land. Perhaps that support might have been better targeted at the people who really need it. There are 4 million children living in poverty, more than 2 million people using food banks. For the first time, we've had those official figures. Surely, Michael Gove, you must accept that the government has some responsibility for that, and there is an element of failure in allowing people in this country to live in that way.
Well, we can always do better, yes, and one of the things that we're seeking to do is to make sure both that we can grow the economy overall and that we can help the most vulnerable. So in Jeremy Hunt's budget, we took steps to help people who were not working to work. So we took steps to expand the labour market, as the economists would call it, but basically to help families. So we're doing more on childcare in order to make it easier for both parents to work, or either parent to work. We're taking steps to change the pension rules so that more people who've been retiring early, particularly those in the NHS...
And the very, very wealthy will be able to have a tax break from the government. That's not about helping people at the bottom.
It helps the economy grow, and it helps cut waiting lists, which is an absolutely critical thing. But more broadly, what we're also doing is making sure that we target support on the poorest to help them through this cost of living crisis.
When it comes to
everything from additional support for the very poorest through things like the pupil premium in the school.
One of the things that was not in the budget, though, was more support for people with housing costs. Now, this is your brief.
Yes.
And I want to ask you specifically, we heard one of our contributors in this studio last week say there was nothing in the budget on housing. And we've heard this week from BBC viewers and also from the official statistics that rents are going up.
Yes.
Very significantly. We've heard anecdotal evidence of rents sometimes going up by 20, 25, even 30%. Is it acceptable for landlords to be putting rent up above inflation?
Most circumstances, no.
And what are you going to do about landlords who are doing that?
Well, we're bringing forward reforms a little bit later this year, in just a couple of months' time, actually, to look at how the private rented sector can be better regulated. We're not talking about rent freezes or rent caps, but we are talking about protection for tenants. At the moment, there is a situation where tenants can be evicted without any fault on their part, and some, a tiny minority of unscrupulous landlords, are using the threat of eviction in order to jack up rents and to victimise tenants. Now, it's important that we recognise, as your question does, that a healthy private rented sector is absolutely vital to making sure that people have the right home at the right place at the right time, but we do need to make sure that we protect tenants from unscrupulous landlords, even as we also give landlords the power to get rid of antisocial tenants as well.
And do you think, just briefly, that there are landlords, some of them right now, who are profiteering, who are using the context of what's going on to make profit at the expense of their tenants?
In every market, there will always be actors who will attempt to exploit circumstances in their interests, not in the public interest, yes.
Now, tomorrow, the government is going to make some announcements on antisocial behaviour. The Prime Minister will be at an event announcing things, I believe. It might feel familiar to viewers to hear a Prime Minister say, aha, I'm going to crack down on offenders, I'm going to crack down on what they might say are jobs in our city centres. And it feels familiar because it is familiar, because Boris Johnson announced this kind of thing. Dominic Raab went and posed with people with high-vis vests on. David Cameron announced this sort of thing. Even Tony Blair back in the day promised that he would be marching yobs, as he called it, to cash points to take money out to pay their fines immediately. This is a rebranding exercise, isn't it, more than anything else?
It's a comprehensive plan which will both see more uniformed officers in hotspot areas where crime is a particular problem and antisocial behaviour blights lives, and faster justice, which will see people who've been responsible for damaging the area in which they live repair the fabric, the social, the civic fabric of the communities that they've undermined. And it will also see investment in making sure that there are alternative activities for young people and that we divert people away from antisocial behaviour before it occurs.
And yes or no, will there be extra money to do this? Or
yes, £160 million.
Well, that's not a huge amount of money if you look at how pressed some of the services are. Now, antisocial behaviour is serious when it happens to people, but if you look at the latest crime survey for England and Wales, the level of antisocial behaviour is actually going down, while at the same time, we hear all the time about record waits for prosecutions, terrible rates of prosecutions for very serious crimes like rape and violent crime. Is this really the best use of government money and really the right priority to have when serious crimes, many people in this country would feel right now, are going unpunished?
Well, I think you have to do both. You have to walk and chew gum. So if you were to go to Willenhall or any of the communities that Andy serves in the West Midlands and say to them, look, antisocial behaviour, not much of a problem, is it? I think you get a pretty tart response. It is the case that there are communities across this country where people feel the high street has been damaged because of the behaviour of thugs and yobs. They feel that they can't walk at night, women and girls in particular, in public spaces because of intimidatory behaviour. We do need to deal with that. It is the case that if you want investment in those areas, then you need to make sure that the pride that people feel in their communities is reflected in an orderly public space, and that means that you need to deal with antisocial behaviour. You are right, however, that we also need to do more in order to ensure the faster prosecution of very serious crimes. And again, the work that Rishi and Dominic Raab have undertaken has seen a significant increase in the number of people being prosecuted and the faster prosecution
from
for rape and serious sexual
low levels
offences.
That have caused a lot of distress to victims.
Well, it is the case that the period of time between someone reporting an offence and the eventual sentence being passed for rape and serious sexual offences was far too long. It was a failure of the criminal justice system. But it is an issue that Dominic Raab has addressed, and it requires everyone from the police who are responsible, obviously, through to the Crown Prosecution Service and the courts working better together. One of the problems that we've had in our criminal justice system is that each of them have operated in silos. We haven't had a system. One of the things about our antisocial behaviour action plan is that it is an example of systems thinking because it brings together police, local government and the justice system.
And it'll be interesting to see the plans in full tomorrow, but part of that we understand is that laughing gas, which some people use to give them a high, is set to be banned. Now, is that true? And why are you doing that when the independent panel that looks at these things on behalf of the government says it's disproportionate to ban it?
Well, we're doing it because if you walk through any urban park, you will see these little silver canisters, which are the evidence of people regarding public spaces as arenas for drug taking. That is unacceptable. People should feel that those spaces are being looked after in a way which means that they are safe for children, that they are not the recourse for people who want to engage in this sort of antisocial behaviour. This drug is one that can have an intoxicating and potentially damaging effect on young brains and young nervous systems, so we need to stop it. The advisory committee offers advice, but ministers ultimately decide. And Rishi Sunak and the Home Secretary have been clear, and I agree with them, that we need to draw a line. You know, there tends to be this approach that, oh, it's only minor, or, you know, let people let off steam. No, these are public spaces that should be safe and orderly. Once you begin to retreat from these public spaces, once you say anything goes, then, as we know, what appear to be small infringements turn into a greater degree of lawlessness. There's a theory, the so-called broken windows theory, that describes this behaviour. If you tolerate low-level disorder, then you lose the attractiveness and security that everyone has a right to expect in public spaces.
OK, well, the Prime Minister will give more detail on all of that tomorrow. But I just want to ask you about some big characters and some big changes that are happening in the political landscape at the moment. Nicola Sturgeon's last morning in the office is tomorrow. What do you think her biggest achievement is?
I don't want to say anything bad or what's the word, negative about Nicola Sturgeon, because I think that she is a dedicated public servant and she's devoted her life to public service. And as First Minister of Scotland, I worked with her during the pandemic. I know that she was committed to coming to the right conclusions in the interests of the people of Scotland. I fundamentally disagree with her on many things, but I wish her well.
Now, some other people that you have worked with and you know well are Matt Hancock and Kwasi Kwarteng. Now, they've both been filmed undercover in a sting by the campaigning organisation led by donkeys and shown to have taken a meeting about a job that would have been a fake job advising a company in South Korea. And they seem to have been asking for rather a lot of money. Do you think that Matt Hancock and Kwasi Kwarteng are worth £10,000 a day?
Well, again, the market, as it were, decides many of these things. But the most important thing is not these negotiations. The most important thing is what every member of Parliament does for their constituents. So you can have people who are both members of Parliament but also do other work. So Maria Caulfield, my colleague, is a nurse alongside being a health minister.
My question is that whether or not you think they're worth £10,000 a day. As a former cabinet minister and somebody like Kwasi Kwarteng, who essentially had to resign because everything blew up on his watch, are they worth £10,000 a day? They've not broken any rules, but conceptually, are they worth £10,000 a day in your view?
I'm not a commentator. I don't pass judgment on other members of Parliament. There are rules that govern what members of Parliament should do and what they should declare. But the jury here is the constituency. So it will be the case, come a general election, if Matt and Kwasi choose to stand again, that their constituents will decide. I think they're both talented people with a lot to offer in the future, but ultimately they will have to answer for the decisions that they've taken. OK,
somebody who still has a constituency is Liz Truss. Yes or no, should she be able to send her friends to the House of Lords?
I think that is a matter for the Prime Minister. I don't think I should speculate on what has in itself been speculation about honours. As I say, my job is to help to ensure that we support local government in its job of delivery. There are people who are smarter, wittier and more perceptive who can offer commentary on other parts of
I'm not sure that you
publics.
don't really have a view on that, Michael Gove, but you're being very diplomatic. Lastly, I want to show you and the audience something that happened this week.
Let's have a show of hands, shall we? Who believes Boris Johnson was telling the truth yesterday?
Wow.
Okay. Wow.
That was my colleague Fiona Bruce asking a question time audience if any of them believed Boris Johnson when he was being questioned by MPs this week about what happened in Partygate. I just want to check with our panel. Did any of you believe Boris Johnson? Stick your hand up if you thought he was telling the truth.
I'll put it half up, and you can
half
I'll
up
explain
from
why.
Andy Street. OK, well, maybe ask him to explain. What about you, Michael Gove? Did you believe what Boris Johnson said to MPs this week?
Yes, I did.
Do you think he's always told the truth?
I think that all of us will at some point have told a white lie or an untruth. But I think the fundamental thing here, and again, the Privileges Committee will make up its own mind. It's looked at all of the evidence. But what was Boris's argument? He was working incredibly hard every hour that the Lord sent in order to try to do the right thing. He believed that saying thank you to people who were leaving in the cramped and confined circumstances of 10 Downing Street was part of that job. Did he attend those events in a spirit of self-indulgence? No, he did so in order to show his gratitude to those who were working with him. It will be for the Privileges Committee to decide, for members of Parliament to decide, but I worked with Boris during that period, and I am inclined to give him not just the benefit of the doubt, but to believe that when he places his hand on his heart and he says he did not think that he was breaking the rules, I do believe him. OK,
Michael Gove, thank you very much for coming in and taking questions on such a range of subjects. Now then, let's talk about that interview and what else is making the news today with our panel. Now, Andy Street, I must ask you, you put your hand half up when we asked you three if you believe Boris Johnson this week. Can you explain it to the other two why you gave him half the benefit of the doubt?
It picks up exactly what Michael was saying. The critical word in that discussion was willfully. And I actually know, we all know, that what was done was wrong. But the question was it being done in an absolute planful way to deceive? And I do not believe that it was.
Andy, why didn't you believe Boris Johnson?
Well, I mean, on this one, it is a question of judgment, and I accept the willful point. But there's a time and a place in public service just to come clean and say mistakes were made. It felt here that mistakes were made.
OK, right, let's get on to other subjects and other things that Michael Gove was talking about with the economy. So when you heard Michael Gove trying to explain why the UK is in a fix, to what extent has the situation we're being in down to this government, and to what extent, to you as an economist, is it actually down to things that were beyond their control? How would you measure out?
Well, I think the lion's share has been two horrible shocks. First COVID and the cost of living crisis. That has done the lion's share of the damage to our prospects as a country, to the incomes of households. It's been a huge effect. You know, incomes, as Richard said on the video, 6, 7, 8% lower than pre-pandemic. For poorer households, even more than that. We are materially poorer as a country and as people as a result of those two shocks.
But what about the politicians' role in all of this, though? I mean, because it is at the end of the day, when it comes to the ballot box, people want to know, are the politicians being honest with them about whose fault things were, and also how credible what they're offering to fix it is?
Yeah. Well, on the fixing part, absolutely there's a role for public policy, through budgets and other stuff, to try and repair the damage done to people's incomes as quickly as possible. As Richard said, right now, it's a pretty leisurely path back to restoring pre-pandemic levels of income, 5 years plus. Is there a case for pressing the accelerator to speed that recovery of income? Yes, I think there is. Some of that was in the budget. More is needed, I would say.
And Christiana, when you look at the UK, I know you look at all sorts of countries around the world, but you've been here this week and you talk powerfully about meeting mums who can't make ends meet. How do you assess how the government has been coping here?
Well, I'm afraid that the UK is not doing as well as it could and should. Richard was very clear about the long-term impacts of runaway climate change on this country. And that is only partial of the impacts that we're going to have across the world. And all of this is actually going to be implicating all of us. So when we think cost of living, we have to think cost of living equals burning of fossil fuels. Let's please make that connection, because otherwise we are looking at factors that, yes, impact, but fundamentally the trend that we're looking at is a very dire trend unless we're acting on climate change.
And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask you for some of the solutions that they might be there. But Andy, I also want to ask you a question about the banks, and are they safe? So for a few weeks in a row, there's been a bit of a wobble around one bank. We talked about SVB in the studio a couple of weeks ago, Silicon Valley Bank. That was bought by another bank, so that was made safe, if you like. But then we see what's happened with Credit Suisse. Huge institution. That's all kind of gone wrong. Deutsche Bank now, big, powerful German bank. Are they really safe?
Well, we've had a huge shock in financial markets over the last 12 months. Interest rates have risen from almost nothing up to 4-5% globally. That will crystallize losses, significant losses. And SVB and Credit Suisse, others prospectively, are some of the casualties of that.
So there could be more casualties?
There, of course, could be more casualties. I suspect many more of them will lie beyond these shores, Laura, perhaps in the US, their regional banks. Will this, though, be the sort of collapse of confidence, collapse of credit we saw back 15 years ago? I think not, actually. Our banks are stronger.
And Andy, I can see you nodding your head there. So now you were running John Lewis during the last big economic crash that we had, the financial crisis. When you look around businesses in the West Midlands, you said before there was exciting growth in some new areas. But what's the sort of overall sentiment? You know, what's the standard feeling when they know that consumers have got less to spend?
Well, it's very interesting because businesses, of course, are always thinking about the future. And data we've just had is future business sentiment, to answer your question head on, is actually remarkably positive. Better in the West Midlands than elsewhere in the country, interestingly. And just to come to the point you were teasing out with Andy, I don't hear from businesses about the credit crunch, literally the shortage of borrowing lines. Actually, we hear that all of our clearing banks are making more money available for SMEs, and we're trying to bring in different forms of lending as well. So that doesn't appear to be the big challenge at the moment.
There are the challenges also some big brands. And I've got to ask you about this as the former boss of John Lewis. There's been speculation that Sharon White, who's been in this studio, the boss of John Lewis now, might actually be going to go away from the model where the staff members are a partner and it runs in a sort of more, they would say they run ethically compared to other big retailers. What do you think about changing the model?
As you know, it's my old life. It's many years since I left and I don't tend to comment on it publicly, but I will give you my sort of reaction, which would be a tragedy if that occurred, because I think John Lewis goes a bit beyond a shop. You know, you can buy the same television in other places, is the truth, but John Lewis was about actually a way of doing business, actually showing the market there was a better way almost. And in fact, that's now potentially, if you believe what it says in the press, under threat. So I would urge the leadership of John Lewis to think about what's really at the heart of it, what makes it special, and hold on to that.
But if it's losing money, can it keep going in the same way?
So you have to address the underlying point. This was ever the case in the John Lewis model over 150 years. If you can't go to the equity markets, you have to either trade your way through it. And of course, some of the best retailers at the moment, Next, Primark, Selfridges, all wonderfully successful businesses at the moment are proving that physical retail can still do that. And that's really the challenge to John Lewis and Waitrose.
OK, well, maybe Sharon White was watching, I don't know, but I'm sure she'll hear it loud and clear, even if she's not watching right now. Now, Christiana, we've promised people some solutions for what you've talked about very clearly is the risk, not just to the economy, but to everything from climate change. Now, you're chair of the Earthshot Prize, the Prince and Princesses of Wales casting around the globe for good solutions. Now, I understand, we see some beautiful pictures here of coral reefs, that actually some clever people have actually come up with a way of growing the coral, saving the coral, which its reduction we know is an environmental threat. Tell us about that.
Well, first let's understand why it's really important. Coral reefs are actually represent the livelihood of 1 billion people around the world. They're also the home of 1/4 of all marine life. So they're basically the canary in the oceans. We have lost 50% of coral reefs already, and we stand the danger of losing up to 90% over the next 30 years. So we have to not just save what we have, but actually restore them so that we can grow. And we have in the Earthshot Prize a fantastic startup in the Bahamas, Coral Vita, who together with many other very, very similar companies and NGOs are developing technologies to grow corals outside of the oceans and then replant them inside the oceans to restore that very important and basic ecosystem.
You can see them, they're meeting Prince William and Princess Catherine there where they're trying to do it. But when it comes to the really big challenges, of course, and you've mentioned it yourself today, fossil fuels and our addiction to the combustion engine.
Indeed.
So what's the solution to that?
Well, obviously the solution on the energy side is to move over to renewable energy. And the good news there is that we are definitely very much on the cusp of an exponential shift, both in renewable energy generation, but more importantly in what that does, that renewable energy generation capacity that is growing very, very quickly, is it allows for many other sectors to also shift.
And hydrogen, a lot of Westminster politicians sometimes talk about the possibility of that.
So if you have enough renewable energy, then you can use renewable energy to produce green hydrogen. Green hydrogen, very important. Mm-hmm. And that green hydrogen can be used to produce ammonia, to produce methane, which means we can actually clean industry, steel, cement, shipping, aviation, all of the things that we cannot electrify.
Forgive me for being sceptical, though. I have heard quite a lot of politicians in this country talk for quite a long time about the potential of hydrogen. and it doesn't ever quite seem to come to pass.
But I think we really are there now. Let's remember that change takes longer than you think, and then it happens faster than you ever thought possible. That is true of hydrogen.
Christiana, thanks so much. Andy?
Christiana, isn't it, that we are decarbonising our economy? If I just look across the West Midlands, a transport system, we're building electric vehicles now like never before. The government's put the change in to 2030 for the rules. We're even beginning to retrofit homes to make those more efficient, and we're thinking about decarbonising manufacturing production. So I know it's not fast enough, but I do genuinely believe we've passed an inflection point.
And Andy, as the elected politician on our panel, what did you think when you saw the Led by Donkeys sting on Matt Hancock, Kwasi Kwarteng and some other Conservative politicians? We can see them there. They haven't done anything wrong or broken any rules, but red faces, surely.
Red faces, but the clue's in how you describe it. It's a sting. I mean, that's the other thing you've got to think. Is that the right way of going about things? I personally believe I've never taken a second job in this role. I actually believe the first priority comes to your constituents. It's a full-time job.
So should MPs not take second jobs?
I didn't say never, but you've got to be very, very selective. Some actually, Michael talked about a few examples, add to it. But the general view of looking for a selection of non-executives, I don't agree with that.
OK, all three of you, thank you very much for now. What an interesting conversation that was. And we've heard what the panel think. We want to know what you think too. You know we always like to hear from you. You can send us an email, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or on social media, we're at BBC Laura Kay. Maybe it would be interesting to hear how you've had to cut back or not. Maybe you're already feeling better off, or maybe you are really feeling the pinch. So let us know, or you can follow the conversation on the BBC webpage as ever. Now, as you know, we will keep talking about what's going on in Ukraine in this studio. That conflict has shown us there are all sorts of ways of being brave. Remember this journalist, Marina Ovsyannikova? She was at work at her TV station one day last year when she decided she couldn't take it anymore. Her sign reads, "Stop the war. They are lying to you here." Now, that decision to burst into a live studio made her a target, a danger to Putin, and she decided to flee, evading capture, running away from border guards, and even one of her escape vehicles got stuck in the mud. She is now safe in Paris, from where she explained to us why she took the decision that changed her life for good.
I had these mixed emotions because before this protest, a lot of factors came together. Well, for a long time, I realized that the Russian TV became like a gigantic brainwashing machine. Well, secondly, I have Ukrainian roots. My father is from Ukraine. At that point, it was like this huge emotional outburst. But I didn't really care what would happen to me later.
How did you feel in those moments?
Well, first of all, I was like 90% sure that I won't be able to get through the security to the studio because of all these issues with security. And so I was thinking I won't be able to protest, but even if I were, it'd probably be a 10-year prison sentence for anti-war protests.
And you had worked, though, at that channel for nearly 20 years. Why had you not spoken up before?
I did shut my eyes to it. I realized that under the circumstances when the Russia's all independent media was destroyed, I won't be able to secure any other employment on TV. I prefer to bury my head in the sand, like a lot of other Russian people, but the war became a point of no return for me.
It did, though, of course, mean that you had to leave the country. How did you escape?
Well, at that point, I didn't have a Schengen visa and my children's passports expired, so I didn't plan to immigrate to begin with. Well, a year later, I was arrested, and in the end, my solicitor did find a way for me to leave Russia. Well, obviously, I can't give you details. Well, the only thing I can say is that it was overnight from Friday to Saturday. We changed about 7 cars. The last car was stuck in the mud. It was not going according to the plan. I was almost screaming, thinking and saying it's better for me to go back to Russia, go to prison. But my daughter was saying, get up, let's go, we have to cross the border.
And how do you feel now about your country? Do you feel ashamed of what's happening in Russia?
Yes, I'm really ashamed that this war started, because when I was working with international channel, a lot of my friends from abroad was texting me, asking what is going on, has Putin gone mad? And I thought, yeah, really, he went mad.
And how widely held do you think your views are inside Russia? And are people just frightened to speak up?
Well, you know, this propaganda is made on a very high level, as it showed recently what effect it has. But also I wanted to say that these people who are working in the main media channels, they don't really believe it. They have similar views to me, and also you can say that people who are pro-Putin, who are convinced in him, is no more than 10 or 20%.
President Putin has now been handed an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court. Do you think that might help bring this conflict to a conclusion, or actually might that even be a badge of honour for him, another symbol that he could use to say that the West is unfairly trying to target him?
I think this is the first signal that the Russian elite should take notice of, and perhaps some kind of resistance will start within the Russian elite, and they might plot against him. At least with some kind of hope for me.
Shortly after you left, you said that your son had told you that your decision to protest like that had ruined the life of the family. Does he still feel that, or do you feel now you have more understanding, or does he understand the personal decision you took?
My son still called me a traitor, that I betrayed our family, I betrayed our country. I can say that for millions of families with the same situation, war ruins a lot of families. And this is a real catastrophe, because Russians are being destroyed by Putin not only physically by him sending them to war, but also on a psychological level. Because now in Russia it's an incredible situation. Russia now deep in depression. There is an apathy everywhere, and millions of people just don't know what the future holds.
Just lastly, Marina, do you feel it will ever be safe for you to go home?
I can't go back now, but I do see my future with Russia. My son is there, my family is there, my mom, and they don't want to leave the country. So for me, I'm not indifferent to the future of this country, and I will fight for the future, even being outside of Russia.
Marina, we hope one day you'll be able to make that return. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. Thank you. Now, it's no secret that the BBC has had a tricky few weeks, surely not in this studio, but there have been accusations of bias flying around from all sides, not least because of the row over Gary Lineker's exploits on social media and the position of the BBC chairman and friend of Boris Johnson, Richard Sharp. Labour's Lucy Powell, who looks after culture and media for the party, reckons it's time for a proper conversation about how the organisation is run. She's announcing an independent review into the BBC, and she joins us from, where else but the BBC in Salford. Lucy, good morning to you. What is wrong that you want to put right?
Well, thank you, Laura. Well, as the Labour Party, we support the BBC as a universal, publicly funded, public service broadcaster that curates our national conversation, that educates our children, that provides trusted local news and news around the world, and brings us together with some of its fantastic content. But the BBC faces some serious headwinds coming up the track. Its future is constantly under attack, constantly being questioned. How it's funded in the future, constantly questioned and under attack. We've seen questions around the independence and the impartiality of the BBC, And in the streaming and platform and social media age, I think we have to look deeply and carefully about what the future is of an organisation like the BBC in the digital and streaming age. And given that the charter renewal process will be well underway by the time of the next general election, I think now is the time for us to really put together a very serious panel of people that I've put together to advise and make recommendations to the Labour Party about how the BBC can not just survive into the next few decades, but can really thrive in the next few decades, because that's what we want to see. So I'm really pleased that people like James Pennell, June Sarpong, Steve Morrison and Lou Cordwell are going to be really spending some serious time thinking about these issues and making some recommendations.
You've mentioned lots of issues there. You've mentioned independence, you've mentioned funding. So let's look at those two in particular. So Labour has raised concerns that with a Conservative backing chair of the BBC, the organisation finds it hard to be properly independent. Would you commit to Labour never appointing somebody to a senior position at the BBC with links to the party?
Well, this is something that obviously the panel will look at and make some recommendations about. But
what's your view? That's a political decision.
Yeah, I personally don't want to, I don't think we should be precluding people from taking up these positions who have previously been involved in politics. But I think what we absolutely have to look at is making sure that the process behind that is fully transparent, completely robust, and that the very best people for the job are appointed, so that you can't have these questions that we've had over this particular appointment process that's now under investigation because I asked for that investigation, but also other board members and the way in which they're appointed as well.
But
so
if
we will be
Labour
looking at these issues.
could be in senior positions at the BBC, wouldn't you then just do the same that you've accused the Conservatives of, basically appointing their cronies?
Well, no, and that's what we want to restore some credibility and confidence in this process. And yes, of course, there were people in the past that have been shared the Labour Party's views and values in terms of their appointment, who then very quickly and rightly so became absolutely independent and impartial. So much so that there were times in the past where they were at great conflict with the last Labour government. So that's what we need to see. But we do need to make sure that the whole process is fully robust and transparent, which it hasn't been in this case. We saw a circumstance where the Prime Minister made it very clear who he wanted to appoint right from the outset, putting off other people from applying. We then had a so-called independent panel, which wasn't independent at all, that really just had to assess whether the candidates passed a very minimum bar of appointability, and then the Prime Minister appointed who he wanted anyway.
Well, that
and then
is being investigated at the moment.
What's being investigated
that is being investigated at the moment, Lucy Powell. But I'm interested, you clearly believe that credibility needs to be restored to this system. Wouldn't the easiest way of restoring credibility just to say, OK, no political links? If Labour was in charge, you would not appoint anybody with any political links. Then you could restore credibility if that's your case.
Well, look, that's something we will look at, but I do think that would narrow the field significantly because, of course, people later in their career, which is often, we want experienced people who've worked across a whole range of positions in broadcasting, in industry, in civil society, coming forward for these roles. People have expressed political opinions, people have got political views and so on in their past. So I don't want to narrow the field so much that you're only then choosing from people who've never expressed an opinion ever before in their entire life. But what I do want to do is restore some credibility, independence and transparency to that process.
Right, you talked about funding. That's one of the other big challenges, and there's often political argument about the licence fee. Is it possible that Labour would keep the licence fee past 2027?
It's very possible. We believe very strongly in a universally publicly funded BBC. So that is where everybody contributes and everybody has access to the BBC, because it's that model that pays for all the things that otherwise wouldn't exist because there's not a competitive market for it, whether that's BBC Bite Size and all the education that was provided during COVID, whether that is world-leading news journalism covering issues like Ukraine or issues all around the world and local news that many other players have left the space from entirely, or whether that's ensuring that we've got brilliant independent British film and brilliant British content for British audiences. You know, these things might not happen without that kind of funding model. But I do think it's important that we closely scrutinise and really reset and rebuild a consensus around some of these issues, because this also is one of the reasons why I think the BBC has not felt that it could be as independent and as punchy as it might want to be, because there are just constant questions about defunding it and getting rid of its funding altogether. And
okay,
I don't think it would survive in that.
It'll be interesting to hear what your review comes up with in the next few months. I want to just finally ask you about another issue. So you're in charge of culture and media for the Labour Party, but also sports. Now, this week we saw the World Athletics Federation make a decision, controversial to many people, called for by many others. They made a decision to ban trans women from competing in women's events. Should other sports follow that example?
Well, other sports have been following that example.
So they should?
I think, look, it is for sporting governing bodies to look at these issues, and it is particular to different sports. And I think, for me, the principles are absolutely inclusion, where inclusion can be achieved fairly and with fair competition, and not where that puts safety issues at risk. So certainly some sports like athletics, rugby, cycling and so on, you can't achieve inclusion with fair competition and meeting those safety barriers. But there are other sports, equestrian or snooker or darts and other sports like that, where you can achieve inclusion without putting those other things at risk. So that's why sports governing bodies should look at these issues themselves closely. But and they're difficult issues to resolve. But I support the action that World Athletics has taken this week.
Okay, Lucy Powell, great to have you on the programme. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from Salford. Thank you for now. Now it's nearly 10 o'clock. Imagine that. And we started this morning asking a simple question that might have a complicated answer. When is everyone going to start to feel better off? Here's Michael Gove.
We're dealing with the aftershocks of two, significant events. So both the war in Ukraine, first time we've had war on this scale on the continent of Europe since the Second World War, and the COVID pandemic, the biggest global health pandemic since the end of the First World War.
Well, we've talked a lot already to our panel about that issue, so I want to close talking about another big political moment that is about to happen, the departure of Nicola Sturgeon, who's been such a big figure in our politics for a long time. She'll be replaced tomorrow by either Kate Forbes, Ash Regan or Humza Yousaf. We've talked to all of them in the last 3 weeks, but Andy, you interviewed Nicola Sturgeon at an event in London this week. Do you feel you really got under the skin of why she's leaving?
Not entirely. We'll tell on that. What was clear, though, is that on some of the signature issues of the day, climate, inequality, democracy, she has more to say on those things, and watch this space on that, I'd say.
Ah, well, that's interesting. Maybe potentially, it has been touted many times, a job at your former organisation, Christiane, the United Nations. I mean, does she have that kind of presence on the world stage? Could you see her?
She does. I think her trajectory and her experience actually would make her a very strong candidate for many international positions, not just the UN. And we also interviewed her on the podcast, Outrage and Optimism. She already sort of let a little piece there that she might be looking at bigger things.
Oh, goodness me. Well, Andy, I know you're a Conservative politician, but you're also one of those big figures outside Westminster. Do you think that she'll leave a hole, one of those powerful figures outside Westminster on our sort of national stage? And, these two have both been very flattering, but a lot of people in your party, I think Michael Gove a little bit, have a slightly different view.
Well, Michael was fair. He said we disagree politically, but he respects what she's, in my view, that what she's done to build the institution of the Scottish Government, that deserves huge respect. And it's got to be good for Britain, is the big point, to have lots of people outside London building their institutions, because Britain will be stronger for that.
OK, well, one of them will be with us actually next week, Tracy Brabin, the Labour Mayor for West Yorkshire. She'll be here with us in the studio. But all three of you, Christiana Figueres, Andy Haldane and Andy Street. First time we've had two Andys in the studio, and very good it was too. And just like that, it is goodbye from me for another week. We've been very un-British this morning. We've talked a lot about money, and politicians hope that inflation will drop a lot by the end of this year. But after shocks and pretty awful economic performance, the contest for your vote is likely to centre around who can offer hope for your wallet and a convincing strategy for the country to pay its way. But the man who earns his wages by making the forecasts told me this morning it might be 5 or 6 years before people start feeling more prosperous. Gulp. You'll hear more from the Prime Minister on antisocial behaviour tomorrow. And don't forget, there will be plenty of coverage on BBC News of the new First Minister of Scotland tomorrow, whoever that is. Great to have your company as ever, and you can always go to iPlayer for more. Or I will see you here next week. Goodbye.